Well, my church background is pretty varied. Having been in the Methodist Church for 10 years, and then the Baptist Church for 10 years, and then the Anglican Church. It's largely driven by the needs of the family. But then music brought us to a little church in Walken, where the choir was wonderful, and my wife and I joined. And then we became involved in the active life of the church. And I particularly was involved on the ministry team, in home group work and so on. And there I saw other readers on the ministry team, and it impressed me that they had something unique. And my minister at the time, Becky Totterdale, encouraged me to go for reader training.
Okay, so do you remember the first time you ever saw a reader and what you thought of them?
I think it must have been in the pulpit. A friend well, now a friend, Paul Cobb, giving a sermon. I thought that's really good. And I found out he was a scientist like myself, and it sounded really in tune. I thought, these readers have got something going for them. So I thought, well, and then I saw him later at the ministry team meeting, and the diversity of what he was doing was also very interesting. I thought, not quite like a vicar, he's got a bit of freedom. So,
what kind of freedom? I mean, what was it?
Well, to use his own talents and his own gifting,
right,
and not to be held back in any way. And the ministry team celebrated that sort of. And I thought, well, yes, I'll think about this, because Becky said, why not go on the training? So I thought about it for a year, and then the answer seemed to be yes. Okay. And that's where it started.
All right. So. What did training at that stage involve? How long have you been a reader?
Over 3 years.
Okay. So, I mean, what does training involve when you train to be a reader? Because you've been a reader for 3 years. They offer this training. What do you do?
Yes. Well, it was a regular weekly commitment at St Albans Abbey, with training here, with expert teachers, on a whole range of materials, you know, from theology to scripture to divinity and his church history. Very interesting, but more than just academic. It was life-changing for me, the study, particularly from a background which is fairly fundamentalist in regard to scripture. Right. That's just an example. It opened my eyes. It helped me become much more liberal in a good way.
Well, tell me about that, because sometimes, from what you're describing for your background, you might have felt threatened, or actually people might have warned you shouldn't take training like this because, shock horror, you might become more liberal. What was liberating about that?
Well, it was, it's a bittersweet thing. You think, well, is my faith going to be affected if, for instance, the scriptures are being questioned, the fallibility of scripture, for example. But to hear learned people talk so intelligently in terms of interpretation of scripture, context, etc., application, and also, for instance, feminist theology. That was first time I've heard it, you know, and then to think outside the box, quite unsettling. And my faith did go in a bit of a dip, and then it sort of was strengthened.
Now, the other aspect, what do you do for a living?
I'm a teacher. Right. I'm a science teacher, physics.
Right. So learning about Christianity, learning about theology. Yes. What do you think that's done to kind of modify what I would imagine is a fairly hard-nailed attitude in terms of science and science?
Yes, that's right. There's sort of a parallel journey in theology and in science. This eye-opening liberal approach in theology entered into my view about science and religion, which has been extremely helpful. I went on a journey which was through creation, through intelligent design, and through to theistic evolution, which is a similar kind of journey of liberation where faith was increased.
So it was a bit of a wobble, but it was all right.
It was a wobble, yes. Okay. And in fact, I've been able to go with that view very much in terms of that being a ministry. Because as a scientist and as a theist, I'm able to go into schools, and I'm invited to talk to sixth form philosophy and ethics students at A level, because there's a whole chapter on it, science and religion.
So you're part of the curriculum.
Yes, and so I present in a balanced way loads of different views on science of creation without being dogmatic.
Yes.
And I think part of my reader training was to train me how to do that.
Right.
Not to be dogmatic, to raise the questions, but on the other hand, encourage people to think deeply. And the students love that. And I enjoy that different way of teaching. After having taught science as this is the only way.
Yes. It actually liberates you as a scientist.
That's right, as a scientist.
Fantastic. So did you only learn in St Albans, or did your training take other forms as well?
Well, it was mainly, the academic side of it was mainly here.
Okay.
We also had practical training in worship. Some of our dissertations involved applications in our church, so that branched out a bit, and pastoral elements.
Yeah.
But the one that really I found quite surprising and influential was the work experience.
Do all readers do work experience? This sounds quite a bit unusual.
Yes, I think it's one of the modules is to get a placement somewhere, whether it's in a church or in some other institution. Most tend to go to another church.
Yes.
And I thought, well, that's going to be more of the same. And I was speaking to my friend Paul Cobb, who did something at the Haven with drug addicts. And he said it was a life-changing experience to be involved in that, but quite risky in terms of, you know, putting yourself in an unknown area. So I applied, and it wasn't accepted. So then I applied to the Lister Hospital chaplaincy team, and they put me on training there to be a hospital chaplain.
Okay.
And this was at Queen Elizabeth in Welling, with a wonderful teacher, Lorraine Summers. And she showed me the ropes. I went there every week for 6 weeks to be trained as a hospital chaplain. And then I went on to the team at Lister, following my licensing as a reader. And that has been a life-changing experience. As having been a teacher all my life, to go into the hospital environment, which is on another planet, dealing with elderly care, with the final lap, you know, dementia, areas that I'm still learning about. And so that goes on to what I'm doing now.
Right. So, I mean, what would you say? I mean, it sounds as if you've experienced the diversity you always hoped when you first heard about what readers did.
Yeah.
What's the thing you enjoy most about being a reader?
Well, I think it's the opportunity to do what comes along. There's the usual stuff, you know, the run-of-the-mill services and so on, being part of the ministry team.
Yes.
But it's the other stuff, which is the really interesting thing. It's the pastoral element, getting involved in fully in whatever opportunity comes along, so the door's open. And also being able to say, well, that's not for me. So it's being able to find what's right for me and then responding to the things that are unexpected.
So it sounds as if it's not what you necessarily expected to be doing when you're a reader.
No. I would not have predicted being involved in chaplaincy work.
So really, is this really a question of being able to say to someone who's wondering about reader ministry, don't assume that you're only just going to be wearing a blue scarf and standing at the front of the church?
That's right. That's the least of the role, I think. The great, if you like, fulfillment, but it is actually being used in other areas. So I would really encourage those going into readership is to look for opportunities to do something risky. In terms of, in their work placement, go for something like voluntary work somewhere that's not in a church.
Yes.
To learn the language that's outside there in society. And that takes a risk, and it did take some courage, but it's so worth it.
Let me ask a question about, it sounds as if you see readers playing a different and complementary role to a vicar, perhaps, in terms of the way you work together in a parish team. How does that work in the hospital, where you have a chaplain, who, as I understand it, is ordained, is running a team? What do you see as the contribution you can make as a reader to a chaplaincy team?
I think it's on two levels. It's the day-to-day voluntary work in the wards, where one is trying to sort of provide spiritual sustenance to those in need on a one-to-one basis. This is all private. Nothing is known about that work. Only you and God know. And that, I think, is very humbling, at the same time good for you. That there's no trumpet blowing saying this is, good works. It's just you and the person in front of you.
Yes.
So there's that level, which reaches into responding to need in prayer, in reading the Bible, in bedside communions, and so on, or offering it, going round the wards, because an ordained minister's not allowed to do that. They aren't allowed to do cold calls.
Are they not?
No, it's in the rules. Whereas as a volunteer, you have complete freedom. You can talk to every single person in the ward as a volunteer. So you have freedom as a reader to do that. And you just get alongside people. Okay, you get some people saying they're not interested in religion.
Sure.
And that's fine.
You have to get used to people saying no. Yes.
And so there you have an advantage as a reader.
Yes.
And then the other level is helping out as a reserve for services.
Okay.
So you have your Sunday morning service in the chapel, and you say, well, if you need any help, and you don't hear anything, and then suddenly you get a phone call, would you mind helping in the holidays, or the 5th Sunday in the month, or whatever.
Sure.
So you go in as a reserve. There you have another bit of freedom. You're not committed to a rota. You can just be there to help. And then you can help in the services, and you get known by the volunteers who do all the wheelchairs, and you run a service, and then you often say, well, shall I do communion by extension? And that's what happened as the next step. So you do a communion service, and so that's how it developed into a much richer experience.
Okay, so you are both covering for what the clergy would normally be doing. So when you do communion by extension, just to understand, is that that there's always a reserved sacrament, which is prepared by the chaplain, and you can kind of go diving in. You don't need to say, is that all right? You know it's there and you can use it.
Yes, I arrange it so there's consecrated elements ready, and I have a special service for communion by extension printed off.
Yes.
That's only for that purpose. It's a nice short version.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what would you say is the most distinctive aspect of reader ministry? So it may be your ministry, it might be that of others. What for you makes what readers do different from what just about anybody else does?
I think it's being able to use your own gifting and have it as totally voluntary. And by that, you don't feel you have to be paid or, and there's less pressure in a way, but more opportunity. But also there's loyalty and support for the team, for the vicar, for the rest who do have those sort of constraints.
Yes.
And so with your freedom, you're more able to help the rest of the team. So that's one aspect. But I don't know, you see, there's so many aspects of readership that I can't really put it definitively into one sentence. New doors open. May I give you an example? When I was in the Lister Hospital, after having done a day round the wards, lunchtime, was in the canteen, and a voice called out, mentioning my name, and it was one of the people who was on my reader training. She's an ordinand. She was an ordinand, and she became a vicar.
Yeah.
And she said, "Hello. Now I know who you are. I've been seeing your name, and I recognise you from the reader training. Would you be interested in applying for a job as a chaplain at the Methodist Homes for the Aged?"
Yes.
So, out of that surprise meeting, well, you might say it's not a surprise, God put it there, but from that opportunity, I became chaplain in 2 Methodist Homes for the Aged, which is where I started in January, and that is now my new career, and I'm retiring from teaching.
Okay, so does that mean you're no longer chaplain in the hospital?
Not at the moment, no. I can't do that at the moment, but I will be going back to it once I've finished teaching.
Okay, and so roughly how many hours a week would you be giving to being a chaplain in the homes?
Well, I'm doing 24 hours a week. I'm part of the team. I'm employed by the Methodist Homes for the Aged as a chaplain.
Right.
And the responsibilities are very clear. At the same time, there is that same freedom. Very similar to readership, in that you are able to carve out what you feel is a spiritual responsibility within an old people's home. There's the usual services and so on, but there's also the one-to-one spiritual sustenance. So I'm just quoting that as an example of how doors open in readership that are unexpected.
Just to unpack this a bit. So with the homes, who are you working alongside? Because it sounds as if within the Lister you're working as part of a fairly big chaplaincy team. How's it at the moment?
So in the Methodist home, I'm working on my own.
Right.
I'm the sole I am called the chaplain of the home I work in, and so I have sole responsibility for whatever happens spiritually within that home.
It sounds like the kind of constraints that you've just been warning me about.
Yes, certain extent. But at the same time, I have checks and balances with a colleague who works at a neighbouring, that's Sue Stilwell, who works at the Letchworth home.
Right.
And we meet each other to just get ideas and help each other. So, and I will take her services when she's doing a funeral, or similarly, she would do the same for me.
Absolutely. So it's not as if you're working in isolation, but in that sense, you're not working within a team in quite the same way as you were in the hospital. If that's clear.
And so, for instance, taking funerals has been a big commitment. So there's an average of once a fortnight I'm taking funerals, which again, as a reader, you do get some training in.
Yes.
And it's well worth getting alongside your minister and watching them do it before and getting the proper training.
Yes. And I mean, it sounds as if you have more than a little busy life. I mean, do you feel that as a reader that you end up being run ragged, or how do you make sure that you don't end up sort of putting in every spare hour? Because presumably you're still involved in your church, so you sound like a very busy person.
Yes, at the moment, but when the teaching stops, it will get a lot better. But there is the understanding, my minister is able to be sympathetic in the rota for the ministry in the churches and how many times I'm preaching and so on.
Yes.
Which he's held back. So there is that mutual understanding of the workload, and he understands that.
How do you get on with other readers? Do you ever see much of them? It sounds as if you're so busy now.
Yes, Paul Cobb I see a lot, and we have long walks. We talk through things, and he gives me the impetus, and being able to sound one thoughts out and get good responses. That's very helpful. I also have another reader who's on our ministry team. We talk less about it though.
That's interesting to hear. Good. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Okay.